What happens when you avoid feedback? Huberman has the answer. What happens when you avoid feedback? Really think about it for a moment. Feedback is everywhere: when you step on a scale, when someone responds to your work, or even when nature pushes back against your decisions. But what if you chose to ignore it? At first, it seems like freedom. No external judgment, no corrections, no harsh truths. Yet, could it be that ignoring feedback is not freedom, but a slow erosion of growth? We live in a world where feedback doesn't just guide us, it defines us. Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist whose work dives deep into the mechanisms of growth, often discusses the role of feedback in shaping performance and mindset. He argues that feedback isn't just an external phenomenon, it's a neurological necessity. Our brains are wired to adapt to mistakes, recalibrate based on input, and thrive through the friction of trial and error. The absence of feedback, then, is not neutrality, it's stagnation, even regression. But let's go deeper. Why do so many of us avoid feedback? Is it fear of failure, fear of judgment, or is it something even more profound, fear of losing the identity we've built for ourselves? Imagine that you've spent years believing you're great at something: writing, speaking, playing an instrument. Feedback has the potential to shatter that illusion. Avoiding it, then, becomes a way of protecting the fragile ego. But is that protection worth the cost? If you avoid feedback, are you truly living? Or are you merely preserving a version of yourself that never evolves? Consider this: when you avoid feedback, you might avoid pain, but you also avoid clarity. And clarity is what allows us to see where we are, where we need to go, and what it will take to get there. Without clarity, we are like sailors lost at sea, rejecting the stars because they remind us we're off course. But isn't knowing you're off course the first step to finding your way home? Ask yourself, what feedback are you avoiding right now? And why? The uncomfortable mirror: why feedback is the birthplace of growth. Feedback is like a mirror, not the kind you stare into when you're feeling confident, but the kind that shows every flaw, every imperfection, every detail you'd rather not see. It's uncomfortable, it's humbling, but it's also transformative. Imagine walking through life without ever seeing your reflection. You might feel confident in your appearance, but would that confidence have any grounding in reality? Feedback forces us to confront the truth about ourselves, not the version we wish to be, but the version we are right now. And as painful as that confrontation may be, it's the only path to genuine growth.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Andrew Huberman explains this through the lens of neuroscience. Our brains are designed to seek feedback, even when we consciously avoid it. Every time we act, our brain predicts the outcome, and when reality doesn't match the prediction, it sends an error signal. This is feedback on a biological level. The discomfort you feel when you realize you've made a mistake, that's your brain recalibrating. It's telling you something needs to change. Ignoring this signal doesn't stop it from happening, it just leaves you stuck in a loop, repeating the same errors without progress. But here's the paradox: while we crave growth, we resist the very thing that facilitates it. Why? Because feedback not only challenges our actions, but it also challenges our sense of self. Think about the last time someone criticized you. Did you feel defensive, angry, maybe even humiliated? These reactions aren't just emotional, they're deeply tied to your brain's need to protect your identity. When someone points out a flaw, it feels like a threat to the narrative you've constructed about who you are. And yet, without that threat, there's no opportunity for transformation. Let's take a practical example. Imagine you're learning a new skill, say, playing the piano. Without feedback, how would you know if you're hitting the wrong notes? You might feel confident in your playing, but that confidence would be based on ignorance, not skill. Now imagine someone points out your mistakes. It stings, but in that sting lies the possibility of improvement. You can correct the mistakes, refine your technique, and eventually play with true mastery. Without feedback, mastery is impossible. But it's not just about skills. Feedback shapes our relationships, our careers, and our character. Think about the people closest to you. How many times have you avoided giving or receiving feedback because it felt too risky? Maybe you didn't tell a friend they were behaving selfishly, or you avoided hearing from a colleague that your work wasn't up to par. In the short term, avoiding feedback might preserve harmony. But in the long term, it creates a gap, a space where growth and connection could have flourished but didn't. Here's the thing: feedback is not inherently negative. It's neutral, it's information. And like any information, its value depends on how we use it. The problem is, we often misunderstand feedback as judgment. When someone points out a mistake, we interpret it as a statement about our worth. But what if we reframed feedback as a gift? What if, instead of seeing it as a threat, we saw it as an opportunity? Ask yourself, what would your life look like if you embraced feedback instead of avoiding it? Would you be the same person you are now? Or would you be someone stronger, wiser, and more capable? Huberman emphasizes the concept of a growth mindset, a term popularized by psychologist Carol Dweck. A growth mindset is the belief that abilities and intelligence can be developed through effort, learning, and feedback. It's the opposite of a fixed mindset, which assumes that who you are today is who you'll always be. When you avoid feedback, you reinforce a fixed mindset. You're saying, I don't want to change, I don't want to grow. But when you seek feedback, even when it's uncomfortable, you're sending a powerful message to yourself and others: I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to improve. Now, let's address a common myth, the idea that feedback is always external. Yes, feedback often comes from others: a teacher, a coach, a friend. But some of the most valuable feedback comes from within. Every time you reflect on your actions, every time you evaluate your progress, you're engaging in self-feedback. The key is to be honest with yourself. Self-deception is one of the greatest obstacles to growth. If you can't acknowledge your own mistakes, how can you ever hope to correct them? Of course, not all feedback is created equal. Some feedback is constructive, offering specific, actionable insights. Other feedback is vague or even destructive, aimed more at tearing you down than building you up. The challenge is learning to discern the difference. Constructive feedback might sting, but it always points toward improvement. Destructive feedback, on the other hand, is more about the giver's insecurities than your growth. The goal is not to accept all feedback blindly, but to approach it with curiosity. Ask yourself, is there truth in this? Is there something I can learn? Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine you could see the future version of yourself, the person you could become if you embraced every piece of constructive feedback you received. What would that person look like? How would they think, act, and feel? Now imagine the opposite, the version of yourself that avoided all feedback, clinging to comfort and certainty. Which version would you rather become? Feedback is the bridge between who you are and who you want to be. It's not always easy to cross, but the journey is worth it. Every time you receive feedback, you're faced with the choice: will you use it to grow, or will you let it paralyze you? Growth requires courage, the courage to look in the uncomfortable mirror, to face the truth, and to act on it. Ask yourself, what feedback have you ignored that could change your life if you acted on it today? The paradox of pain: why discomfort is the catalyst for excellence. Let's dive deeper into why feedback hurts and why that very pain is essential for growth. Pain, whether physical, emotional, or intellectual, is often seen as something to avoid. Our instincts tell us to shy away from discomfort, to stay safe, to avoid the sting of rejection, failure, or criticism. But here's the paradox: pain is not the enemy. In fact, discomfort is the birthplace of excellence. Without it, there is no progress, no mastery, no transcendence. Feedback, in its essence, is the discomfort that keeps us honest, humble, and growing. Think about this: when you exercise, your muscles tear on a microscopic level. That tearing process is painful, but it's also what allows your body to rebuild stronger. The same is true for your mind and your spirit. Feedback tears at the ego, at your sense of certainty, at the narrative you tell yourself about who you are. It disrupts your comfort zone. But just like with your muscles, the tearing is necessary for rebuilding. The pain of feedback is the price of becoming better. Andrew Huberman's research reveals something fascinating about how our brains process feedback. When we receive criticism or negative input, it activates the same regions of the brain that process physical pain. This is why feedback can feel so personal, so raw. But here's the good news: just as the body adapts to physical stress, the brain can adapt to the emotional stress of feedback. The more you expose yourself to it, the less threatening it feels. Over time, you develop resilience, not by avoiding feedback, but by embracing it. Here's a question for you: why do we fear pain when it's often the only thing that wakes us up? Think about the moments in your life when you've grown the most. Were they moments of ease and comfort? Or were they moments of challenge when you were forced to confront your limitations? Growth doesn't happen in the absence of struggle, it happens because of it. Feedback is the struggle that forces us to evolve. It's the fire that burns away our illusions and reveals the truth. And yes, the truth can hurt. But as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. The problem is, many of us don't see feedback as a gift, we see it as a threat. We take it personally. If someone says you need to improve your communication skills, we don't hear an opportunity, we hear an attack. Why? Because we confuse feedback about our actions with feedback about our worth. But they're not the same. Your worth is intrinsic, unchanging. Feedback is simply information about what you can do better. It's not a judgment of who you are. Here's an analogy: imagine you're a sculptor, and your life is a block of marble. Feedback is the chisel. Without it, the marble stays rough, undefined. It might have potential, but it will never become the masterpiece it could be. Every piece of feedback you receive is a stroke of the chisel, carving away what doesn't belong and revealing the beauty within. The process might feel harsh, even violent, but the end result is worth it. Ask yourself, what parts of your life need the chisel of feedback? What rough edges are you afraid to smooth out because you're afraid of what it will take? Let's not romanticize this process, it's not easy. Receiving feedback requires humility, vulnerability, and courage. It means admitting that you don't have all the answers, that you're not perfect, that there's room for improvement. And that's hard. But it's also liberating. When you open yourself to feedback, you free yourself from the need to pretend. You don't have to fake perfection, you just have to commit to progress. Now, let's look at another layer of this paradox. While feedback can be painful, avoiding it often leads to even greater pain in the long run. Imagine you're driving a car and the check engine light comes on. You could ignore it, it's easier, less stressful. But what happens if you keep driving? Eventually the engine fails and the problem becomes much harder to fix. Feedback is like that check engine light. It might be inconvenient, but it's there to prevent bigger problems down the road. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away, it just makes the consequences more severe. Huberman often emphasizes that feedback, when processed correctly, rewires our brains for success. When you receive constructive criticism and act on it, you create a feedback loop, a cycle of action, reflection, and improvement. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. Your brain starts to crave feedback, not as a threat, but as a tool for growth. This is the essence of the growth mindset, seeing challenges as opportunities, failures as lessons, and feedback as fuel. But here's the catch: not all feedback is helpful. Some of it is misguided, biased, or even malicious. The key is discernment. You don't have to accept every piece of feedback you receive, but you do have to evaluate it. Ask yourself, is this feedback coming from someone who wants to see me grow? Is it specific and actionable? Does it align with my goals and values? If the answer is yes, embrace it. If not, let it go. Just because someone offers feedback doesn't mean you're obligated to take it. Here's another thought experiment for you. Imagine you're standing in front of two doors. One door leads to a life of comfort, where you never have to face criticism or challenge. The other door leads to a life of growth, where feedback is constant, but so is progress. Which door would you choose, and why? The truth is, the pain of feedback is temporary, but the rewards are lasting. Every time you confront your flaws, you get closer to your potential. Every time you act on constructive criticism, you take a step toward mastery. And every time you embrace discomfort, you build the resilience to face whatever comes next. Ask yourself, what is the pain of feedback trying to teach you right now? Are you willing to listen? The infinite loop: how feedback creates a life of continuous growth. Here's the most profound truth about feedback: it's not an event, it's a process. It doesn't happen once, twice, or even a handful of times in your life. Feedback is a constant. It's an infinite loop, cycling through every decision you make, every action you take, and every outcome you experience. The question isn't whether feedback exists, it does, always. The real question is, are you paying attention to it? Are you willing to step into the loop and let it transform you over and over again? Andrew Huberman's insights on growth and performance highlight something extraordinary: the human brain thrives on iteration. Every action generates a result, and every result provides feedback. That feedback, when acted upon, refines the next action. This cycle of action, feedback, adjustment is not just how we improve, it's how we survive. It's how evolution works. It's how humanity has built civilizations, created art, and unlocked the mysteries of the universe. It's how you, as an individual, become who you're meant to be. But here's where it gets philosophical. If feedback is infinite, then growth is infinite too. There is no final version of you, no ultimate state of perfection. There's only the next iteration, the next level of understanding, skill, or character. This is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminds us that we'll never arrive, empowering because it means there's always room to become more. Feedback is the engine of this endless evolution. Ask yourself, what would it mean to embrace a life where growth never stops? Would it scare you or excite you? The beauty of this infinite loop is that it allows us to transcend our limitations. Think about it: every time you act on feedback, you're expanding your potential. You're becoming a version of yourself that didn't exist before. You're creating a future where your current weaknesses are strengths, where your current doubts are certainties, where your current limitations are stepping stones. This isn't just self-improvement, it's self-transcendence. And yet, this process isn't linear. Growth isn't a straight line, it's a spiral. Sometimes you'll feel like you're revisiting old struggles or repeating mistakes, but each time you cycle through the feedback loop, you're doing so at a higher level of awareness. The challenges might look the same, but you're not the same. You're stronger, wiser, more equipped to handle them. This is the power of feedback. It doesn't just change what you do, it changes who you are. Here's the hard truth. Though many people will step out of the loop, they'll resist feedback, avoid discomfort, and settle for the illusion of stability. But stability is an illusion. Life is dynamic, constantly shifting. To resist feedback is to resist life itself. The only real stability comes from adaptability, the ability to learn, adjust, and grow in response to whatever life throws at you. And adaptability is impossible without feedback. Now, let's bring it all together. What happens when you avoid feedback? You stagnate. You lose clarity. You miss the chance to evolve into your best self. But when you embrace feedback, when you step into the loop, you unlock the potential for infinite growth. You become someone who doesn't just react to life, but shapes it. Someone who turns mistakes into lessons, criticism into fuel, and discomfort into strength. So here's my final question for you. Are you willing to step into the infinite loop? To embrace feedback, no matter how uncomfortable, as the catalyst for your evolution? The answer to that question will define not just what you do, but who you become. The loop is waiting. Are you ready?